The night Luna Hugelmaier disappeared did not arrive with thunder. It arrived softly, quietly. So quietly that no one noticed anything was wrong until it already was. No screams cut through the darkness. No neighbors looked out their windows. No alarm sounded. There was only absence, a space where a living, breathing woman had existed just hours before and then didn't. Luna had lived a life that felt safe, predictable. The kind of life people point to when they say, "That could never happen to me." She followed routines. She answered messages. She came home when she said she would. She was not reckless, not chasing danger, not running from anything. She believed stability was protection, and for a long time it seemed like she was right. Friends later struggled to explain how someone like Luna could simply vanish. They spoke about her softness, the way she listened more than she spoke, the way she remembered birthdays and small details that others forgot. Luna believed in people. She trusted easily. She assumed honesty. That belief shaped her world and quietly placed her in danger. That day had started like so many others. Morning light, familiar movements, familiar faces. Nothing felt off. Nothing hinted at what was coming. This is what makes cases like Luna's so disturbing. There was no obvious moment where everything went wrong. No single choice that clearly led to disaster. Just a sequence of normal events that slowly drifted toward something irreversible. When the first phone call went unanswered, it didn't feel alarming. People miss calls. When the second went unanswered, concern crept in. By the third, something tightened in the chest. When night fell and Luna still hadn't come home, concern transformed into panic. Panic into dread, dread into a fear that no one wanted to say out loud. Those closest to her felt it immediately. This wasn't independence. This wasn't space. This wasn't Luna. She didn't disappear. She didn't abandon plans. She didn't vanish without a word. And yet that's exactly what had happened. Police were notified. Questions were asked. Forms were filled out. The initial response was procedural. Adults leave. Adults take breaks. Adults start over. But the people who loved Luna knew better. They felt the weight of something wrong pressing down on every unanswered question. As investigators began retracing Luna's final known hours, the story started to blur. Timelines shifted. Small details refused to line up. Someone remembered a conversation differently. Someone else couldn't remember at all. Statements sounded correct but hollow. Like lines practiced just enough to pass but not enough to convince. The more investigators listened, the quieter the truth became. Luna's life, once so simple, began to fracture under scrutiny. Relationships were examined. Routines were dissected. Every smile in old photos was reinterpreted. Every argument, no matter how small, was magnified. Stability began to look like a performance. Calm began to feel staged. Behind closed doors there were tensions no one had noticed. Silences that now felt heavier. Moments that once seemed insignificant now glowed with suspicion. Love, it turned out, did not always mean safety, and familiarity did not always mean honesty. There were whispers, nothing solid, just rumors of distance, of emotional drift, of secrets carefully folded into daily life. The kind of secrets people convince themselves don't matter until they do. Investigators circled back to the last person who should have known where Luna was, the last person she trusted, the last person to see her leave or not leave at all. Their words were calm, measured, cooperative, but something about them felt rehearsed, too smooth, too contained for someone whose life had just been torn open. Still, there was nothing concrete, no evidence of violence, no signs of struggle, no witnesses to anchor the fear. Just a growing sense that the truth was being hidden behind politeness and procedure. The house was searched. The car was examined. Personal items were accounted for. Everything appeared normal, almost too normal, as if life had paused mid-sentence and waited for someone to notice. By morning, Luna Hugelmaier was no longer just missing. Her name spread beyond her circle, beyond her town. She became a headline, a case. A question mark that refused to resolve itself. For her family, the waiting became unbearable. Every ringing phone carried hope and terror in equal measure. Every knock at the door threatened to bring answers or end them forever. Sleep became impossible. Silence became unbearable. And yet the silence remained. What haunted investigators most wasn't what they found, but what they didn't. No chaos, no trail, no clear moment where the world broke. Just a woman who stepped into her life one day and never stepped out again. This is how the most devastating stories often begin, not with violence, not with noise, but with trust, with routine, with the belief that the people closest to us are incapable of harm. Luna Hugelmaier trusted her world. She trusted the faces around her. She trusted that normal meant safe. And somewhere in that trust, something went terribly wrong. By the time the sun rose fully that morning, one truth was already clear, even if no one was ready to say it yet. Luna had not simply disappeared. She had been erased from the ordinary rhythm of life, and whatever had taken her did not want to be found. The silence surrounding her disappearance wasn't empty. It was heavy, intentional, and it was only the beginning. Nothing fractures reality faster than realizing the truth has more than one version, and none of them agree. From the moment the investigation deepened, the case stopped making sense and never recovered. What had once felt like a straight line shattered into fragments. Phone records suggested one story. Witness statements suggested another. Surveillance cameras offered brief, silent glimpses, never long enough to explain anything, never clear enough to settle doubt. Luna appeared and vanished between timestamps like someone moving through cracks in time. Present one moment, gone the next. Investigators replayed her final hours again and again, hoping repetition would reveal something hidden. Instead, it exposed how incomplete every account truly was. A call placed but not answered. A message sent but never replied to. Locations that overlapped without explanation. Nothing was outright false, but nothing fit. As questioning intensified, the people closest to Luna found themselves under harsh light. Friends sat across metal tables, hands folded, voices trembling as they tried to remember details they had never thought mattered. Family members repeated the same answers until words lost meaning. Grief, once private, became a performance evaluated for sincerity. Trust eroded quickly, too quickly. Investigators focused on patterns: who spoke first, who hesitated, who filled silence with too much detail. Small things began to feel enormous. A delayed phone call that should have been immediate. A text message sent hours later than expected. A reaction that didn't match the moment, not wrong enough to accuse, but wrong enough to notice. And the last people who had seen Luna alive suddenly became the center of gravity. Their routines were dissected, their relationships re-examined. The domestic space, once a symbol of safety, became a possible crime scene. Familiar walls, familiar rooms, familiar lies. The idea was uncomfortable, disturbing, but impossible to ignore. As investigators dug deeper, cracks appeared beneath the surface of Luna's life. Not chaos, not violence, but distance, emotional gaps that had been quietly growing, silences that had gone unspoken, the kind of fractures that don't look dangerous until something breaks. There were whispers of tension, of arguments disguised as conversations, of a relationship that looked intact from the outside but strained beneath routine. Nothing explosive, nothing dramatic. Just enough imbalance to suggest that not everything had been as peaceful as it appeared. Then the media arrived. Suddenly, Luna's face was everywhere. Her name repeated by strangers who had never known her. Online forums filled with theories. Comment sections turned speculation into accusation. People dissected her personality, her habits, her choices, searching for meaning in things that had once been ordinary. It was brutal and relentless. Strangers argued over what kind of person Luna had been, as if defining her could explain her disappearance, as if labeling her could justify what had happened. The humanity of her life was reduced to fragments, screenshots, headlines, timelines. Meanwhile, investigators felt the pressure closing in. The public wanted answers. The family wanted justice. And the case continued to resist both. Every new piece of information only deepened the confusion. Possible motives failed to align with opportunity. Opportunities failed to explain outcomes. Theories collapsed under scrutiny. The truth seemed to shift just out of reach every time it came close. Then everything changed. A discovery, quiet, clinical, devastating, shifted the case from unsettling to horrifying. Evidence emerged suggesting Luna had not simply disappeared on her own. This wasn't a voluntary vanishing. This was an escape. Something violent had interrupted her life. The realization hit like cold air to the lungs. This was no longer a missing person case. It was something darker, something deliberate, something that could not be undone. And yet, even with this turning point, the case refused to move forward. No arrest followed. No confession surfaced. Evidence suggested intention, but not enough certainty. Suspicion grew heavier, but never crossed the line into proof. Investigators stood at the edge of resolution, staring into a void where answers should have been. The people closest to Luna felt the weight of it most. Knowing something terrible had happened, without knowing exactly how, or why, was its own form of torture. It turned memory into a weapon. Every shared moment became suspect. Every loving gesture re-examined through the lens of betrayal. The idea that danger could come from within the home was almost unbearable. The possibility that trust had been misplaced. That love had concealed something else entirely. But true crime teaches a hard lesson. The most devastating betrayals rarely come from strangers. They come from those close enough to know our routines, our weaknesses, our silences. As weeks turned into months, frustration hardened into despair. Leads dried up. Witnesses stopped calling. The media moved on to newer tragedies, but for those living inside Luna's story, time stopped. She was no longer just a woman who had vanished. She was the center of a contradiction that refused to resolve. Evidence without certainty, suspicion without proof, grief without closure. Somewhere within the conflicting stories, the delayed messages, the rehearsed answers, and the quiet rooms where conversations had once happened, the truth still existed. Whole, intact, waiting, but truth does not always announce itself. Sometimes it hides. Sometimes it survives by remaining silent. And as the investigation stalled, one question lingered, heavy and unanswered. What if the reason this case made no sense was because the truth was being protected by the very people who were supposed to reveal it? The mystery tightened, the silence deepened, and the truth remained just out of reach, patient, devastating, and unresolved. The truth didn't crash into the room. It didn't knock down doors or arrive with sirens. It slipped in quietly, so softly that it almost went unnoticed. It began with a detail no one had cared about before: a timestamp. A minor inconsistency buried deep in reports already read a dozen times. An adjustment so small it felt meaningless, until it didn't, until someone paused, looked again, and felt that cold, unmistakable pull in the chest that says something is wrong. Investigators realized they hadn't been chasing missing evidence. They had been chasing the wrong story. The timeline was rearranged, just slightly, but that slight shift changed everything. Movements that once seemed random now aligned too perfectly. A gap that had been dismissed as coincidence suddenly looked deliberate. What once appeared harmless now felt designed. And that's when the pattern emerged. No one had lied outright, no dramatic falsehoods, no wild contradictions. Instead, the truth had been portioned out carefully, measured, controlled, pieces offered freely while others were quietly withheld. A half-truth is harder to catch than a lie. It sounds honest, it feels cooperative, and it builds trust just long enough to survive. The pressure returned. Heavier this time, interviews were repeated, questions asked again but in a different order. Silence stretched longer between answers, stares lingered, bodies shifted in chairs, words began to slow, stories that once flowed smoothly now snagged on themselves. And then it happened, not a confession, a collapse. One version of events buckled under its own weight. A detail changed. A memory suddenly corrected itself. A sentence was stopped halfway through and restarted differently. The story didn't explode, it cracked, quietly, fatally. Hope surged through the room. This was it, the moment everyone had been waiting for. The moment when Luna would finally be more than a photograph and a question mark. The moment when the truth would step forward and say its name. For the first time, justice felt close enough to touch. But true crime does not care about hope. What followed was not resolution, but reality. Legal lines were drawn. Evidence was measured not by what it suggested, but by what it could prove. And that difference between knowing and proving became everything. The truth, so clear in theory, became fragile under the weight of law, circumstantial, inconclusive, insufficient. The system demanded certainty. It demanded proof beyond doubt. And the case could only offer probability. Strong probability, painful probability, but not enough to lock a door behind someone and call it justice. The realization hit like a second loss. Luna's family had lived through the agony of not knowing. Now they faced something just as cruel, knowing but not being able to act on it. Answers existed, but they came without consequences. Truth stood exposed but untouched. It was a betrayal of a different kind, not by a person, but by the limits of the system meant to protect them. The turning point had arrived just as promised, but instead of ending the story, it changed its meaning. This was no longer about solving a case. It was about living with what could never be finished, about carrying certainty without closure. For those who loved Luna, the wound deepened. Grief hardened into something permanent, something sharp. They replayed conversations, re-examined memories, wondered how long the truth had been sitting in plain sight, hidden behind politeness and routine. The idea that everything could be known, yet nothing done, was unbearable, and still the silence remained. No courtroom reckoning. No final confession. No moment where the truth was spoken aloud for everyone to hear. Just an unspoken understanding that settled heavily into the room and never left. This is the part of true crime we rarely prepare for, the part where justice doesn't arrive, where morality and legality part ways, where the truth exists, but cannot save anyone. Luna became a symbol of that gap, a reminder that the world does not always punish wrongdoing, that betrayal can hide behind normalcy, that domestic spaces can hold secrets darker than strangers ever could, and that sometimes the most devastating crimes are not loud, but carefully concealed. The moral is cruel but unavoidable. Knowing the truth is not the same as proving it, and proving it is not the same as stopping it. As the case stalled, the question was no longer what happened to Luna. That answer lived quietly in the shadows of the evidence. The real question became something far more unsettling. How many people live with the truth and never face it? The turning point had come and gone. The story had cracked but not broken open. And the truth, though visible now, remained untouchable, waiting. The story did not end with flashing lights or closing arguments. It did not end with a verdict read aloud in a crowded courtroom. It ended the way it had begun, with silence. Years passed, but time did not soften the questions. It hardened them. They sat frozen, untouched, waiting for answers that never arrived. What happened in Luna Hugelmaier's final moments? Who knew more than they ever admitted? And how does a person vanish from life yet remain trapped inside memory? For those left behind, grief did not fade, it transformed. It became heavier, sharper. Because mourning without an ending is a different kind of pain. There is no final breath to accept, no certainty to hold on to, no justice to place between the living and the dead. Just an open wound that refuses to close. Luna's family learned that silence can be louder than truth, that unanswered questions echo longer than screams. Every holiday carried her absence. Every birthday marked another year without resolution. They were forced to live inside a story that never reached its final page, and slowly the world moved on. Headlines faded, attention drifted, new tragedies replaced old ones, but for those who loved Luna, nothing moved forward. Her name remained suspended in time, attached to a case file, a memory, a silence that refused to break. The hardest realization came quietly. Not all crimes end with justice. Not all truths are rewarded with accountability. Sometimes the system does everything it can and still fails, not because it doesn't care, but because it demands proof where only truth exists. This is the uncomfortable moral truth Luna's case leaves behind. Goodness does not guarantee safety. Trust does not guarantee protection, and familiarity can be far more dangerous than strangers. Luna did everything right. She lived carefully, she trusted those close to her, she believed normal meant safe. And yet her life was taken apart not by chaos but by quiet, by routine, by the assumption that danger announces itself. It doesn't. Sometimes it sits at the dinner table, sometimes it shares a bed, sometimes it hides behind ordinary days and familiar faces. Luna's story is not just about a crime, it's about fragility, the fragility of normal life, the fragility of truth. How easily silence can replace honesty when no one is forced to speak. How justice can be delayed not by indifference, but by the impossibility of proving what everyone already feels. Her name lives on not because the case was solved, but because it was, because remembering her is an act of resistance, against forgetting, against apathy, against the quiet erosion of stories that never receive closure. Each time her name is spoken, the silence loses a little of its power, and yet the unanswered questions remain. Somewhere the truth exists in full, untouched, complete, known by someone who has never had to say it out loud. That truth moves through the world unseen, protected by time, law, and the fragile barrier between suspicion and proof. That is the final betrayal, not just the act itself, but the fact that it may never be answered for. Luna Hugelmaier became a reminder of something we rarely want to face. That justice is not guaranteed, that systems have limits, and that sometimes the most devastating crimes leave behind no sound at all, only absence. The moral is simple, painfully simple. Pay attention, ask questions, protect one another, and never assume that what doesn't make sense isn't real, because some stories don't end. They linger. Some cases are impossible to understand, but they still deserve to be remembered. And as long as Luna's name is spoken, as long as her story is told, the silence has not won, not yet.